My brother tricked our dying dad into changing the will, so I secretly recorded everything and exposed him at the funeral. I'm a 34-year-old man, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one who stayed. When my mother passed away, my father was never quite the same. The house felt too big, too quiet. While my younger brother Mark packed up and left town to find himself, I stayed behind to make sure Dad wasn't eating dinner alone every night. I told myself it wasn't a burden. It was what good sons did. Dad was a proud man, the kind who still ironed his own shirts and refused help even when his hands started to tremble. He'd always believed that hard work and loyalty spoke louder than anything else. I guess that's why I stayed. I wanted him to see that I'd inherited that same stubborn sense of duty. Our days fell into a rhythm. Early coffee, small repairs around the house, and evenings spent in front of old movies where neither of us had to talk to understand each other. When the doctor told us it was late-stage cancer, Dad took it like he took everything, stoically. He even made a joke about how it figures I'd get sick after finally paying off the mortgage. I laughed, but inside I felt like something inside me was collapsing. The thought of losing him terrified me. But I promised myself I'd make his last months peaceful. No chaos, no drama, just time together. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the empty chair where Mom used to sit and whisper, "Guess I'll be seeing you soon." Those moments broke me. But I'd still smile, refill his tea, and pretend everything was fine. Because that's what the good son does. He carries the weight quietly. I thought staying meant something, that loyalty had value. But I was wrong, horribly wrong. Mark showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, sleepy day when even the wind sounded tired. I was in the kitchen making soup for Dad when I heard laughter in the hallway, the kind that didn't belong in a sick man's house. I turned, and there he was, my brother, tan, smiling, dressed like life had been kind to him. "Hey, big bro," he said, setting down a bottle of whiskey and a bouquet of flowers. "Heard the old man needed some company." Dad's eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning. He reached for Mark's hand and said, "You came back." His voice cracked, half disbelief, half joy. I wanted to be happy too, but there was something in the way Mark grinned, something rehearsed. He hugged Dad, looked around the house, and muttered, "Wow, it hasn't changed at all." That night, I watched him slip into old habits, turning on charm like a switch, making Dad laugh so hard he coughed. He told stories about his business trips, about how he'd been too busy to call, but now he was ready to make up for lost time. Every sentence sounded like a performance, like he knew he had an audience. At dinner, he raised a glass and said, "To Dad, the strongest man I know." I forced a smile, but my gut twisted. For years, Mark couldn't bother to send a card, and now he was here, playing the hero. Dad didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He just looked happy. After everyone went to bed, I caught Mark standing in Dad's study, looking at the framed photo of our parents' wedding. He didn't notice me in the doorway when he whispered, "It's all going to be mine anyway." I didn't know what he meant then, but that sentence would haunt me soon enough. It didn't take long for Mark to make himself at home again. Within a week, he'd taken over Dad's mornings, helping him organize paperwork, making breakfast, and insisting they catch up in private. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe Mark was finally trying to be a better son. Maybe this was guilt turning into something decent. But every time I passed Dad's study and heard the low murmur of their voices, my stomach tightened. One night I paused outside the door. I could hear Mark saying, "You know, Dad, you've done so much for me. I just wish I could repay you somehow." Dad's frail voice answered, "You already have, son." Then Mark's tone shifted. Smoother, colder. "No, I mean really take care of things. Make sure your hard work doesn't go to waste." The next morning, I saw him walking out of the study holding a thick folder, the same one Dad used to keep his financial papers in. "What's that?" I asked. He smirked. "Just some bills and insurance junk. You wouldn't get it." Then he brushed past me, humming like a man who'd already won something. That evening, Dad seemed quieter than usual. When I asked if everything was okay, he smiled weakly and said, "Your brother's been helping me sort things out. He's grown up more than you think." The words stung, even though I knew they weren't his. They were Mark's. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the oxygen machine from Dad's room, wondering if I was just paranoid. But then I remembered the look on Mark's face, that smug confidence, and I knew. He wasn't here out of love. He was planning something. Something I couldn't see yet, but could already feel closing in. A few mornings later, I came home from the pharmacy and found a stranger's car parked in our driveway. Sleek, black, and far too polished for our quiet street. Through the living room window, I saw Mark sitting beside a man in a suit, both leaning close to Dad. My chest tightened. When I walked in, Mark flashed that fake smile. "Oh, hey," he said casually. "This is Mr. Harlan. He's just helping Dad with some paperwork." "Paperwork?" I repeated, glancing at the briefcase on the table. The lawyer nodded politely but wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad looked uneasy, his hands trembling slightly on the armrest. "It's nothing serious," he murmured, avoiding my gaze. "Just getting my affairs in order." I wanted to ask what kind of affairs needed a lawyer when Mark had been whispering in his ear for days, but I didn't want to upset Dad. Instead, I stood there in silence, watching Mark hand him a pen. "Just sign here, old man," Mark joked, but his tone carried a weight that didn't sound like humor. Dad hesitated, then scribbled his name, his fingers shaking. When they left, I followed the lawyer out to his car and asked what this was about. He hesitated before saying softly, "Your father requested some updates to his estate documents." Then he drove away before I could ask more. That night, I went through Dad's filing cabinet. The folder with the will was gone. My pulse hammered. I confronted Mark in the kitchen, and he didn't even deny it. "You worry too much," he said, smirking. "Dad's just making sure things are fair." "Fair?" I shot back. "You mean convenient for you?" He stepped closer, voice low. "If you keep sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, you'll regret it." I'd never seen that darkness in his eyes before, and I realized this wasn't just sibling rivalry anymore. It was a warning. After that night, the house changed. It felt colder, heavier, like every corner held a secret I wasn't supposed to find. Mark started controlling everything. Dad's meals, his medication schedule, even who was allowed to visit. Whenever I tried to help, Mark would intercept me with that sickly sweet grin. "Relax, bro," he'd say. "You've done enough. Let me handle it now." But Dad wasn't the same anymore. He'd drift off mid-conversation, his once sharp eyes clouded with worry. Sometimes he'd grab my hand, whispering things that didn't make sense. One evening, as I was tucking him in, he squeezed my wrist with what little strength he had left and murmured, "Promise you won't hate me when it's all over." I froze. "What do you mean, Dad?" I asked, but he just smiled faintly and said, "You'll understand soon." I couldn't sleep that night. The sound of the oxygen machine's steady hiss filled the house, mixing with the faint creak of Mark pacing down the hallway. Around midnight, I heard him whispering on the phone, his voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught something that made my stomach drop. Once it's signed, everything's final. The next morning, Dad looked weaker, his breathing shallow, his skin pale as paper. Hospice care started visiting daily, and Mark acted like the perfect son in front of them. Attentive, loving, patient. But the moment they left, his mask slipped. He'd snap at me for asking questions, sneer when I tried to feed Dad myself. The night before Dad passed, he called me close again. His voice was barely a whisper. "I just hope you forgive me for how things turned out." His hand trembled in mine, then went still. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But the guilt in his eyes told me whatever Mark had done. Dad had gone along with it. The morning of the will reading felt surreal. The air outside was still heavy with the smell of rain, and the house, once full of Dad's quiet routines, now felt hollow. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan, arrived precisely at noon, carrying a neat leather folder that seemed to hum with finality. Mark strutted around like he owned the place already, wearing one of Dad's watches and flashing smiles at the few relatives who'd shown up. I sat in the corner, numb, just waiting to hear what Dad had left behind, not for the money, but for meaning. for acknowledgement that all those years I stayed had mattered. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat and began reading. At first, it sounded normal, the usual legal phrases and pleasantries, until he got to the division of assets. To my son Mark, he read, I leave the family home, my savings account, and all remaining investments. My breath caught. That was nearly everything. To my son, he continued, I leave my father's pocket watch as a token of gratitude. There was silence, thick, suffocating silence, before Mark leaned back and smiled. Well, that's fair, he said lightly. He knew I'd take care of things. I wanted to scream. Everyone in that room knew I'd been the one changing bedpans, driving to appointments, sleeping on the couch for months while Mark was off chasing his next adventure. I felt the blood drain from my face. I managed to ask, did Dad say anything else? Maybe record something? The lawyer avoided my eyes. Your father was very clear. These were his wishes. Mark put a hand on my shoulder, feigning sympathy. Guess hard work doesn't always pay off, huh? He whispered. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. Outside, in the cold drizzle, I stared up at the house, my home, and realized I'd just lost everything. Not just what was written on paper, but the proof that my loyalty had ever mattered. And somewhere deep inside, anger began to rise, quiet, sharp, and patient. For days after the will reading, I wandered through the house like a ghost. Everywhere I looked, Mark's presence had already infected it. His cologne on the couch cushions, his designer jackets hanging where Dad's old coats used to be. I should have packed up and left, but something in me refused to go. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about truth. I couldn't shake the image of Dad's trembling hand signing those papers, his whispered apology echoing in my head. While sorting through boxes in Dad's study, I found a small wooden box tucked behind the filing cabinet. Inside was a USB drive labeled in his handwriting, "For my sons." My heart pounded. I plugged it into Dad's old laptop, expecting maybe letters, maybe a goodbye message. Instead, I heard his frail voice, calm, steady, tired. Mark, please. I don't think this is right, Dad said in the recording. Mark's voice followed, slick and manipulative. Dad, come on. You know how much I've struggled. He'll be fine. He doesn't need all that money. Think of it as fixing your mistakes. I'm not sure. You said yourself you wish you'd done more for me. This is your chance. There was silence, then the sound of Dad's shaky sigh and a pen scratching across paper. I froze. Every instinct screamed to storm into the next room and confront Mark, but my hands trembled too much to move. The file was real. Dad had been coerced, but audio wasn't enough to challenge a signed will. I needed proof of manipulation. Then I remembered something. A random detail from weeks earlier. Dad's oxygen machine. He'd once told me it had a built-in voice recorder he used to leave reminders for the nurses. If that machine captured what I thought it did, it might hold everything I needed to destroy Mark completely. That night, I tore through the hospice boxes stacked in the garage, desperate and shaking. The smell of disinfectant still clung to everything, a bitter reminder of those final weeks. I finally found the oxygen machine buried beneath folded blankets. It looked harmless. Gray plastic, silent, unassuming, but I knew it might hold the truth that could shatter everything. I carried it to my room, plugged it in, and scrolled through the old audio logs until I found one labeled by date. The same week Mark had helped Dad finalize the paperwork. When I hit play, I heard the faint hum of the oxygen line, then Mark's voice, clear, smooth, venomous. You don't want people thinking your favorite son got nothing, do you? He said softly, after everything I've been through, you owe me that. Dad's voice came next, weak, trembling. I just don't want any fighting between you boys. There won't be, Mark replied. He'll understand. He always does. Then the sound of paper rustling, a shaky pen dragging across it, and Dad whispering, I hope he forgives me. I sat frozen, tears burning my eyes. It was all there, the coercion, the guilt, the manipulation. My heart pounded as I replayed it over and over, letting the ugliness sink in. I felt sick, not just at Mark, but at the thought that Dad had died believing he'd betrayed me. For a long time, I just stared at the machine. I could ruin Mark completely with this. But if I went to court, it would drag Dad's name through the mud. Every memory of him would become a public fight. I didn't want that. I wanted something cleaner, something that would expose Mark for exactly what he was, in front of everyone he'd fooled. And that's when it hit me. The funeral wasn't over yet. There was still one part left. The memorial gathering next week. And if I played this right, that's where Mark's perfect image would finally die. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when grief finally hardens into purpose. I spent the next few days rehearsing every detail in my head. Mark thought the funeral reception was going to be his stage, another chance to charm the relatives, give a fake tearful speech, and soak in their sympathy. He had no idea it would turn into his undoing. I called Mr. Harlan, the lawyer, and asked if he'd be attending the memorial. When he confirmed, I told him there was something I needed him to witness, something about Dad's final wishes. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. Then I reached out to a few close family members, cousins, old neighbors, and asked them to stay for the slideshow after the speeches. Dad recorded something special for everyone, I said. It wasn't a lie. The night before the service, I sat at my desk editing the slideshow on Dad's old laptop. Pictures of him and Mom faded across the screen. Their wedding, our childhood birthdays, lazy summers in the backyard. But near the end, I inserted a black screen with one line of text. For my sons, the truth. Right after that, I embedded the audio file from the oxygen machine. No captions, no commentary, just his voice. As I listened one last time before saving it, I could almost hear Dad's regret bleeding through those words. I whispered to the empty room, "Don't worry, Dad. You won't be the villain in his story anymore." By the time I finished, it was nearly dawn. I packed up my laptop, printed a backup copy on a flash drive, and sat in the silence, heart pounding. Tomorrow, everyone would see the truth. And Mark, the golden boy, the manipulator, the son who came back too late, would finally face what he'd earned. The memorial hall was packed. Relatives, neighbors, old co-workers, all murmuring softly beneath the dim amber lights. A slideshow screen stood against the wall, framed by flowers and a single photo of Dad smiling beside his fishing boat. I stood near the back, unnoticed, watching Mark charm his way through the crowd. He wore a dark suit, perfectly fitted, his voice dripping with that fake sincerity everyone seemed to eat up. "Dad always taught me about family," he told Aunt Marjorie, hand over his heart. "I just hope I made him proud." When the pastor invited him to speak, Mark took the stage like he'd been waiting for it all week. His tone was smooth, deliberate, every word polished to sound noble. "My father was a man of integrity," he said, voice breaking on cue. "He believed in forgiveness, in second chances. I only wish I had more time to thank him for his faith in me." People sniffled. Someone clapped softly. I stood by the projector, waiting for my cue. The pastor nodded, signaling to begin the slideshow. Soft piano music filled the room as photos of Dad's life began to fade across the screen. Childhood snapshots, fishing trips, family dinners. People smiled, whispered memories. Then the screen went black. The music stopped. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then the hiss of static. "Mark," Dad's frail voice echoed through the speakers. "Please, I don't think this is right." A ripple of confusion spread across the crowd. Then came Mark's unmistakable voice. "You don't want your favorite son getting nothing, do you?" Gasps filled the room. Heads turned toward him as his face drained of color. On the screen, the recording continued. Dad's pleading, Mark's manipulation, the pen scratching paper. Then the final line. "I hope he forgives me." The silence afterward was suffocating. Mark tried to speak, but no sound came out. His perfect image shattered in front of everyone. And as people began whispering, disgusted, horrified, I finally looked up at my brother. For the first time in years, he didn't have a single lie left to hide behind. For a moment, the room was frozen. No one breathed, no one moved. Then came the murmur, a wave of disbelief spreading through the mourners like wildfire. Aunt Marjorie gasped. "Is that his voice?" While another cousin muttered, "My God, he made his dying father change the will." Mark stood in the center, pale and trembling, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Fake," he finally spat, voice cracking. This is fake. He edited this." He pointed at me like a drowning man grabbing at the air. I stayed silent, just staring at him. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan, rose from his chair. "That recording was made on a hospice oxygen machine," he said calmly. "The timestamp matches the day your father signed the new will." Mark's mouth opened, then closed again. The crowd turned on him, whispers sharpening into judgment. "How could you do that to your own dad?" Someone hissed. "You stole from your brother." Another snapped. He tried to speak over them, but his voice broke apart under the noise. He stormed toward me, rage twisting his face. "You think this makes you the good guy?" He snarled. "You were always jealous." I met his eyes and said quietly, "No, Mark, I was the son who stayed." He froze, just for a second, before grabbing his coat and shoving past the crowd. The heavy church doors slammed behind him with a sound that echoed like thunder. Mr. Harlan walked over, expression grave. "I'll need to review this," he said. "If what I heard is legitimate, the estate will be frozen until we sort this out." The guests began leaving in stunned silence, some offering quiet condolences, others shaking their heads. I sat alone on one of the pews as the hall emptied, my hands still trembling. I'd exposed the truth, but the victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt hollow, raw, because even though justice had begun, I couldn't escape the ache that Dad's last act had been a lie, one forced out of love, twisted by manipulation. Weeks passed before the storm finally settled. Mr. Harlan called me back to his office one gray afternoon. Papers spread neatly across his desk. He looked tired, older somehow. "The court reviewed the audio," he said. "Given the coercion, your father's final will is void. His previous version, the one signed before Mark returned, will be reinstated." I nodded slowly, feeling both vindicated and heartbroken. It wasn't victory I felt, just relief. Quiet, heavy relief. Mark didn't show up to the hearing. I heard through a cousin that he'd left town the next day after the funeral, sold his car, quit his job, disappeared. No one knew where he went, and I didn't ask. There was nothing left to say. People still whispered about what happened, how the golden boy finally destroyed himself trying to win. I didn't correct them. Sometimes silence is the only kind of justice that matters. When the estate was settled, I used my portion not for revenge, but remembrance. I started a small scholarship in Dad's name at the local trade school, for kids who stayed close to home to take care of their families, the ones who always got overlooked. It felt right, like reclaiming the meaning of loyalty that Mark tried to twist into greed. A few weeks later, I visited Dad's grave. The air was still, the grass soft beneath my shoes. I placed his old pocket watch beside the headstone and whispered, "It's okay now, Dad, I understand." Then, for the first time in months, I hit play on the final audio file I'd found on that oxygen machine, one I hadn't been ready to hear before. Dad's voice, fragile but warm, filled the air. "Thank you for staying." The sound cracked something open in me. I smiled through the tears, the kind that hurt and heal all at once, because in the end, I didn't win anything. I just restored what should have never been stolen, and that was enough.